Okay, let's get started. As I said, welcome everybody to the Mental Health and Neuroscience webinar and masterclass. And tonight we're talking about understanding stress, or excuse me, traumatic stress across the lifespan. But this is the fourth webinar and masterclass that we've conducted for the Mental Health and Neuroscience program. And before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping points. Firstly, to say that this webinar will be recorded and made available to people who registered for this. So thank you. It's a very popular event. We've had almost 2,000 registrations. We will have, so thank you for that as well. We're hoping to answer many of your questions at the end. We might not get through all of them, but we'll try to follow up with your questions as best we can at some other time if we can't get through them today. So I do encourage you to use the question and answer function or the chat feature in the Zoom. And as I said, we'll go through the questions at the end. Tonight, we're going to talk a lot about eligibility, so hopefully we can cover a lot of those questions as well. So with those housekeeping issues covered, I'd like to introduce the panel. Firstly, myself, Dan Hermens. I'm the Professor of Youth Mental Health and Neurobiology at the Thompson Institute. I'm also the Program Coordinator for the Mental Health and Neuroscience postgraduate programs that we run out of the Thompson Institute. And with me today is my colleague, Dr. Chrissy Driver, and Chrissy is the course coordinator for the Mental Health and Neuroscience postgraduate programs, and also a very active researcher at the Thompson Institute. So hopefully you can see this title slide quite fine. And I'd like to now start with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands upon which we gather today. And on behalf of the UniSC team, I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are participating in this webinar. I also would like to acknowledge those with a lived and living experience of mental ill health. Bear with me for a second. So as I've mentioned, myself and Chrissy will be covering some of the content in tonight's webinar and masterclass. First, Chrissy is going to give you an overview of the mental health and neuroscience programs, talking about things like admission requirements, how to apply, and what the course is made up of. And then at the end, or the second part, I'll be doing a masterclass, and it's going to be about understanding traumatic stress across the lifespan. Very quickly, the Thompson Institute, it's a research institute, part of the University of Sunshine Coast. We address some of Australia's most pressing mental health issues, and we do this through this care model where we undertake clinical advocacy, research, of course, and education aspects. And a quick summary of those things there. We cover a whole range of research programs from youth mental health to suicide prevention, stress-related disorders relevant to the topic tonight. We have imaging and a whole range of other research platforms. Advocacy, we cover public events, a lot of community outreach. We have a range of clinical services that in the context of this webinar, the education focus in terms of postgraduate programs is, of course, in mental health and neuroscience, but we also have many PhD and Masters of Research students involved with things at the Thompson Institute. I'm going to talk more about the Thompson Institute and the future of it at the end of the webinar. But as I touched on before, we have a whole range of research programs, and running across those programs at the Thompson Institute are platforms, as we describe them, where we undertake clinical trials in molecular biology, as I mentioned before, imaging, and then also running across these are a whole range of clinical services, and they integrate these very much with our education and training products, and also in our engagement with partners and community. So just a quick video now from one of our students in the Mental Health and Neuroscience postgrad program, and I'll just throw over to them.
The information that I've learned through this course has been applied into my job many times when it comes to the vulnerable populations, those at risk of mental health and suicide. By studying online, I can still get a postgraduate education while working in the job that I love.
As an educator, we certainly are tasked with delivering the curriculum, but we're also tasked with ensuring that the young people are safe and supported.
I'm an advanced care paramedic with the Queensland Ambulance Service, and I work as a rural reliever across a lot of regions in Darling Downs. I chose to study neuroscience and mental health at USC because they offered an in-depth background into the neurobiology of mental health to better understand why mental health develops and how to better treat the symptoms and conditions that patients have.
I've obviously got a real vested interest in mental health and neuroscience, having done my background in psychology and then continuing to work with young people each and every day. So I've been able to engage with a lot of the learnings in my current context as a secondary school educator, particularly around mental health and mental illness in adolescence. I work full-time at the moment, so obviously online study was my preferred option. In my classroom teacher role, I teach senior psychology. So I've found that being able to engage with the content in this program has enhanced my practice as a classroom teacher and certainly warrants a lot of interest from my students.
So what I really like about being involved in this program is, first of all, it's one of a kind in Australia. It's the only fully online mental health and neuroscience course. The other aspect I really enjoy is actually getting to see the students, even though it's in an online setting, getting to chat to them and hear about how they're already applying their knowledge in their professions and in their practice.
Studying online means that I don't have to go into uni. I can study from home in my own environment, in my own downtime. Each week we get to have Zoom classes and ask real-time questions and get answers from experts in the field.
The great thing about what the students get to experience in terms of the teaching staff is that we have such a wide range of contributors to the content. So the students get to hear from a variety of experts at the Thompson Institute who are all at the forefront and cutting edge of their research areas. So we have a very multidisciplinary cohort: paramedics, nurses, counsellors, social workers. Everybody's recognising that this is a really important aspect of their work.
As educators, we know that the young people in our care are faced with unprecedented amount of challenges, and having the knowledge and developing this literacy around mental health and neuroscience is invaluable for us educators because it helps us to ensure that the students in our care are well supported.
Studying mental health has been really important for me because as a paramedic, I can deliver that frontline care to those in crisis, be able to help those people who are often misunderstood or stigmatised to break that barrier and deliver the best possible care that I can.
Thank you. And I think it's over to me now. So I'm going to talk to you about our mental health and neuroscience program. So as you can see in this video that we've just shown, we have a range of students from lots of different backgrounds, including all areas of, allied health, mental health, other medical professions and frontline workers, but we do also have a lot of students in backgrounds from other areas such as education, public relations and business, policy and government, and many more. So what we are seeing is that a range of professions are recognising that having this mental health and neuroscience literacy is important to enhance their current practice or profession. And so if you want to, expand your career horizons or start a career in emerging research fields like this, or even going on to higher degree by research, or apply mental health support in your current career, this program is applicable for a wide range of multidisciplinary fields. So we currently offer a graduate certificate, graduate diploma, and now we've started the Masters in Mental Health and Neuroscience. So currently the graduate certificate and graduate diploma both have Commonwealth supported places on offer. So this drastically reduces the cost of these courses. We do know that postgraduate study is expensive, so this is really good news for our students and future students. For those of you who are wanting to apply now, we do still have Commonwealth supported places. So these programs are actually nested. So this means that you can start in the graduate certificate if you wanted, which is the 4 courses. And this will give you a taste of the content before potentially committing to the grad dip. And then you can upgrade to the graduate diploma, which means then you just complete the additional 4 courses to make it that total of 8. And we will go through those courses, the different courses in a moment. And now we also have the Masters, which is on top of the 8 courses that you would do for the grad dip. And this has a bigger research focus. And this does include a supervised thesis using secondary data, conducting data analysis, manuscript writing, etc. So the idea of this master's is really to then give you the research tools and also an alternative pathway to HDR, so high degree by research, if that's something you're interested in. So the eligibility for the courses are slightly different, and we'll go through those in a moment in terms of the graduate certificate, graduate diploma and masters. But currently the graduate certificate is offered part-time, so 2 courses per semester, but you are able to complete the graduate diploma full-time, so that would be 4 courses. Again, you can do the graduate diploma part-time as well, and there's not really any particular order that you need to do the courses in, so you can start in semester 1 or semester 2. The master's then is a little bit different because you have to complete all of the graduate diploma courses before you can then continue on to do that research focus at the end. Okay, so let's have a chat about eligibility. So in terms of eligibility, you may actually be surprised at the variety of kind of backgrounds and degrees that might be relevant. So obviously an undergraduate degree in health, science or psychology, etc., is helpful in terms of those foundational skills and knowledge, but we do also consider people with degrees in unrelated areas. And we have actually had a number of students without, a highly relevant degree who've actually done really well in our course and been as successful as those who have more seemingly relevant degrees. But we do find with our students who don't necessarily have a relevant degree that it can be a bit of a steep learning curve, especially if you don't have a solid science or a health or psych background. But in saying that, it's not impossible. And so, we are also interested in finding out if you have any vocation or work experience in the mental health services as well. So we do look at applications where people have got work experience. So the full criteria and eligibility criteria are online. So have a look at those. So if you don't have a relevant background, but you want to apply and you've got the experience and you get accepted, you don't need to worry because we do have a lot of scaffolding to build, I guess, that basic neuroscience knowledge, and the neuroscience components that we talk about are really focused on being applied in a mental health context. So although this, is a mental health and neuroscience course, we don't expect you to come away knowing absolutely everything about the brain. Neuroscience is such a massively growing area of research and knowledge at the moment, which is super exciting, and that's a really great time to be involved in a course like this. But yeah, it is, a huge area, and we're not expecting you to know everything about the brain. So some students do find it tricky to begin with a lot of the neuroscience language, because it can be a little bit daunting and very new. But it does become more manageable as you progress through the course, and you will start to notice themes across the content, especially in terms of things like relevant brain regions and networks and neurotransmitters and things like that. So in terms of career pathways, what I can tell you is what our current students are giving us examples as to how they're actually using this degree to benefit their current careers. For example, the assistant principal you saw in the video is drawing on that knowledge from the course to be more across the neuro aspects of psychology, but also to enhance his understanding of the current mental health issues that are facing youth in his school. This has enabled him to better support his students, but also his teachers. For other people with different backgrounds, it's about becoming more specialised in their current mental health or health practice. But also we're seeing that having our students having more in-depth mental health and neuroscience knowledge is giving them a better understanding of their clients' needs across lots of different professions, and really getting that kind of holistic perspective. Other students have used their degree to enhance their resume or CVs when applying for more senior positions, or even advancing their career prospects, or moving into more, I guess, mental health and wellbeing based roles within their organisations. And, many organisations now value health and wellbeing, so having employees with this knowledge is preparing them for the future in terms of skills in the workforce. And obviously there's also the pathway to high degree by research and entering emerging research areas. So in terms of the program content, we'll just go on to the next slide, Dan, and you can jump to the next one actually. I'll just talk about these things in a bit more detail. So the course, in terms of the course structure, we do sit within USC's usual semester dates, meaning that we offer 13 weeks of content. But because this is offered fully online, you can choose when you do your study. So the only deadlines you do have are the assessments. And for those who do want a bit more structure, you do hear from the course coordinator regularly, and you can choose to follow along week by week if you like. Everyone sort of wants to know what's the time commitment with online learning. So generally the university recommends about 10 to 12 hours per week, which sounds like a lot, but you know, per course. And that's just a rough guide. Now, what this entails is about 3 to 4 hours of what we would say taught content. Sorry, Dan. Yeah, that's the right one. Taught content, which for our particular modules online includes, you know, the core concepts and the readings, and that other time that you would spend on your study would be your self-study and doing the self-check exercises, activities, and obviously working towards your assessments, which you know, can do in your own time. With our online courses, you can obviously structure this in a way that suits your work and life commitments. So you can decide when you do your study during the week. Our modules generally are designed to take a couple of hours to complete, but then longer if you engage in some of the post-module activities that we have. Now, these are optional and not marked, but they are designed to help consolidate your learning and help you to start preparing for your assessments. And then any additional time on top of this is your own self-study and assessment work. So in terms of our assessments, we generally focus on interpretation of the most recent research for a specific topic. And then we're looking at critically evaluating that research and then synthesizing the evidence base. So we really are encouraging the skills of science communication with various different assessment styles, rather than testing knowledge just through, you know, big exams or standard essay writing. So we are aiming to send our graduates out with the skills to communicate and apply their knowledge in a variety of settings, rather than just remembering content. So you do get to apply this content in your own practice as well with some of the assessment items that we have. So most of our students do work part-time or full-time. So many have chosen to study part-time. Now, this can be 1 or 2 courses per semester. And the feedback that we've had from students tends to be that this is a better way to pace the learning. It allows our students to focus more on the content in more depth, and then provides opportunity to apply your new knowledge in your current practice straight away. But we do also have students who do manage the full-time load, so it's really up to you to think about how much time you can allocate to study over the period of the semester. The content itself is this unique combination of mental health and neuroscience, as we've been saying, and it's developed by a huge range of researchers, clinicians, and educators who are at the forefront of the areas. So having this wide variety of contributors really enables us to deliver the most current, emerging and evidence-based content. So this does allow us to provide that unique blend of mental health and applied mental health and neuroscience, with the content coming directly from experts who are actually working and researching in this space anyway. So I do want to reiterate that the courses are not mental health with a little sprinkling of neuroscience. They are very much about a balanced blend. So you will be learning a lot about neuroimaging and how we apply neuroscience knowledge to mental health research and practice. As you'll hear later from Dan in this masterclass, understanding the brain is crucial to helping us better understand mental health, and then also how we can maximize diagnosis and treatment for mental disorders. So this really makes our program different to other mental health programs that you may see. And it's currently still the only fully online program that is combining the mental health and neuroscience. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Thanks, Dan. So each module of content is broken up into different styles of learning materials. So it is delivered in a unique multimodal way. So we don't have this traditional, 2-hour recorded lecture that you sit and watch at home, and then, some tutorial-based content. So you'll actually get a taster module after this webinar, and that taster module is a really good example of what one of our actual modules looks like in terms of the multimodal platform. So Firstly, in our modules, we have readings from academic journals, which set the scene for the module. And what you'll notice is that none of our courses are textbook-based. And this is because, as I said, we're developing and updating the content regularly based on the latest research. So the reading generally comes from academic journals. Then we get the core concepts, which are delivered in our engaging multimodal format, which you'll get a taster of after this webinar. And that's really what you would get, the content you would get in your sort of 2-hour lecture. We then have a range of interactive activities, questions and reflections that you can choose to engage in if you want to. And they just, consolidate, sorry, that keeps coming off my slide, consolidate your learning, but it also does build towards the assessment items. So it's quite a good idea to get involved in those activities. And they're the type of things, I guess, that you would normally do in a tutorial or class workshop, but you get to do that at home on your own computer in your own time. As I said, these are all optional, so you can choose how much you interact with your peers and your coordinators online, or you don't have to at all. So we do have Zoom drop-ins throughout the semester as well. So you do get an opportunity to meet your peers, to collaborate, to discuss the concepts, and also to ask questions about the assessments. So while these courses are fully online, you do have multiple opportunities to connect. But if you're a more autonomous learner, there's no obligation to engage in any of the activities or come to the Zoom sessions, because the way the content is provided ensures that all learners have got the opportunity to access all the information necessary to be successful in the course. So I'm just going to quickly talk you through just briefly what the courses cover in terms of the 8 courses that are in the graduate diploma. So starting off with the 4 that make up the graduate certificate. So in our Mental Health and Neuroscience Translational Research course, we learn about how across the lifespan mental disorders differ in their onset, type and complexity. So we know that current diagnostic approaches and treatments remain limited and in some aspects are lacking. So what we do in this course is focus on translational research to better understand mental disorders and optimal treatments, but also how the latest scientific research findings are then put into practice. So we explore novel approaches to diagnosis and treatment, such as things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, ketamine, and neurofeedback. In our youth mental health and neurobiology course, we really unpack how adolescence is a dynamic period of significant physical, cognitive, and social and emotional maturation. We learn that this is also a difficult period because this is when the brain is undergoing significant structural and functional changes. And also we know that half of mental health conditions do emerge by the age of 14. So there's a huge need for understanding adolescent neurobiology. So we do investigate the neurobiology of the disorders that emerge in adolescence and focus on key factors that affect the mental health of adolescents, including things like social connectedness, cyberbullying, and also things like sleep-wake patterns. So you'll hear some of the fundamental information about adolescent neurobiology and also, the effects of things like trauma on the brain. So next, we have a whole course that's devoted to neuroimaging mental health, which is on offer in semester 2 this year. This is probably the most technical course, but as I said, you're not expected to learn all the intricacies of brain imaging. We learn how MRI has allowed researchers to understand how the brain is wired in health and disease. And we look at the latest imaging technologies that are used in mental health and neuroscience research, but we do have a particular focus on MRI. So we do also learn a little bit more about transcranial magnetic stimulation and magnetic resonance spectroscopy and EEG techniques, and how all of these things are actually used in conjunction with things like AI and machine learning. So we investigate things like neuroimaging biomarkers in mental health to understand risk profiling, diagnosis and treatment, and how neuroimaging supports the pursuit of knowledge in the mental health context. So we also have a whole course on understanding and preventing suicide. So we know suicide is a significant and complex public health problem. For some age ranges, it's actually the leading cause of death. Its impacts on the communities are far-reaching as well. So we cover the major theories of suicide, the current evidence base around its neurobiology, things like innovations in assessment, prevention, and how this translates to policy changes as well. So we do explore person-centered practices and we look at priority populations and also the role of the community in suicide prevention. So finally, our graduate diploma courses. So we have Healthy Brain Aging course, and this covers the spectrum of declining cognitive function from normal brain aging at one end to diseases such as mild cognitive impairment and dementia at the severe end. So whilst healthy aging is accompanied by changes that do impact cognition and behaviour, dementia is one of the, is a major cause of disability among older people, with about 10 million new cases per year worldwide. So in this course, we will address the neurobiological changes that occur in these different diseases, so along that spectrum. However, we do learn that lifestyle factors can protect against dementia risk by up to 50%. So we do learn about how lots of different lifestyle interventions can prevent the onset and progression of things like dementia. In our neurocognition and mental health course, we learn how the different neurocognitive factors that are specifically linked to underlying brain regions, networks, and processes, we understand how they work. So we then explore how neurocognition has been actually utilised to better understand the functional impacts of various mental illnesses. And so a range of cognitive functions, such as things like attention, memory, decision-making, affective regulation, metacognition, and social cognition, all play key roles in current mental health research. So we unpack how these measures provide insights into, the underlying neurobiology of these disorders. A stress-related disorder course uncovers how stress promotes vulnerability to or exacerbates symptoms of most mental illnesses. So we know that stress-related disorders result from an atypical event. And so, sorry, I've just lost my place. An atypical response to anxiety due to physical, mental, emotional stress. And that post-traumatic stress disorder can develop if feelings of fear, anger, and depressed mood persist after exposure to a traumatic event. So we do learn about those atypical responses to trauma and how these lead to disorders, and then also how the brain changes, and also how this manifests then into the debilitating symptoms of PTSD. So we discuss how current treatments have not been really very effective, and so we explore emerging evidence behind novel therapies in this space, and I'm sure you're going to hear a little bit about that from Dan later. Finally, our lifestyle factors course covers how nutrition, physical activity, sleep, substance use, stress management, social networks, and the environment are all lifestyle factors that shape and impact mental health and well-being. So in this course, we learn about the emerging evidence space in lifestyle medicine and explore ways that this approach can be adopted as an early intervention strategy, as well as how it can supplement other therapies in the treatment of mental health disorders. So as I said, after this webinar, you'll all get a taster version of one of our modules, and this will give you actually a little snippet from all 8 courses that we offer. So you'll get a little taster about everything. And this will give you also an idea of our multimodal platform and what that looks like. Thanks for listening. I'll hand you over to Dan. I'm sure you're all eagerly waiting to hear his masterclass.
Thank you, Chrissy. Okay, so this masterclass is about understanding traumatic stress across the lifespan. The content is from multiple modules in the MHN programs. As one would imagine, this could be a very broad topic. However, we are going to briefly explore the potential enduring impact of traumatic stress across different stages of life. This session will focus on the ways traumatic experiences alter neurobiology and how these changes manifest throughout the lifespan. So to do this, I'm going to cover the following topics. Prenatal maternal stress, impacts on mother and children, adverse childhood experiences, and the impacts of early life stress, the neurobiology of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, and the impact and lifelong consequences of trauma and PTSD on aging. To set the scene, all MHN modules start with a blurb like this. Most Australians will experience trauma at some point in their life, with more than half of the population experiencing trauma before they turn 17. In this module, we will now focus on stress related to trauma and its impacts. We'll explore PTSD and begin to understand what it is and how it's diagnosed. So that's from the 3rd module of our stress-related course, the stress-related disorders course. And then we touch on the list of learning outcomes and proceed with the module content. We curate content from a wide variety of sources, including articles from the conversation. In this thought-provoking 2017 article, it addresses some misconceptions and stigma associated with PTSD, highlighting that while most people associate PTSD with soldiers who have experienced war, is far more common in populations with a high exposure to complex trauma, such as sex workers, women fleeing domestic violence, survivors of childhood abuse, and Indigenous Australians in particular. Furthermore, while certain occupations increase the risk for PTSD, people with histories of complex trauma are more likely to find work where trauma is an occupational hazard. And those with histories of child abuse or adverse childhood experiences are more likely to develop PTSD in the line of duty, so to speak. In February, we conducted a masterclass on the topic of childhood trauma and maltreatment and intergenerational trauma. And in this masterclass, I'm going to elaborate on some of these themes that we touched on in the last webinar. The first being prenatal maternal stress. As the name suggests, PNMS refers to the stress that a mother experiences during her pregnancy. It can be chronic and linked to ongoing events in a woman's life, or acute, linked to sudden changes in the environment. Research has shown that PNMS is associated with negative consequences in fetal and infant development. As you will learn about more in this masterclass later on, when a person is exposed to an event that is perceived as stressful, the brain triggers a cascade of events, ultimately leading to the release of stress hormones such as cortisol. These stress hormones help prepare the individual to cope with the stressor. However, it's been demonstrated that in pregnant women, these hormones pass from the mother to the fetus via the placenta. Studies have found that high maternal cortisol levels correspond with high fetal cortisol levels, and in such exposure can have negative consequences on the developing fetus as well as impacting postnatal development. Research around the impacts on pregnant women who experience natural disasters is an important way to understand PNMS. This is because by their nature, disasters tend to have sudden onsets and are generally considered to be independent stressors. As such, disasters are seen as natural experiments in PNMS research. The first prospective study of PNMS was by Susan King and colleagues and included the Thompson Institute's new director, Professor Alain Brunet, called Project Ice Storm. And this was initiated after ice storms struck southern Quebec, Canada in January 1998 and left millions of people without electricity for up to 40 days. The research involved women who were pregnant during or within 3 months of the storm, and they were recruited 5 to 6 months after it. The three key measures were mothers' objective exposure to hardship, their degree of distress, much like post-traumatic stress-like symptoms, and saliva samples to assess cortisol patterns. Importantly, effects of PNMS from the storm have been found in nearly every domain of child development examined by these researchers. The degree of maternal objective exposure was found to impact children's cognitive and brain development, as well as obesity and epigenetic factors, while maternal subjective distress was linked to autistic traits in their children. Also, there were significant timing effects with exposure early in pregnancy linked to poorer cognition at age 2, autism-like traits at age 6.5, while second trimester exposure was associated with shorter gestation lengths and other birth outcomes, and poor fine motor skills were associated with exposure in late pregnancy. Amazingly, the Project Ice Storm researchers have followed up their children participants for 2 decades. One particularly interesting study involved 39 of them who at age 19 years underwent MRI brain scans to examine their grey matter volumes and functional connectivity. There were 3 primary findings. First, relative to controls, these young adults exposed in utero to the ice storm showed larger volumes in a range of cortical and subcortical areas, including the anterior cingulate cortex, the occipital cortex, and the hippocampus. Second, enlarged ACC, occipital cortex, and hippocampus were also accompanied by increased functional connectivity in the eye storm impacted youth compared to controls. Finally, within the eye storm group, maternal subjective distress was associated with occipital pole thickness in a time-specific manner. The anterior cingulate and hippocampus they're parts of the brain that express very high levels of glucocorticoid receptors, and I'm going to talk more about that later. And this may explain why their structure and function are most frequently altered in response to stress. The authors suggest that these findings demonstrate that the consequences of disaster-related prenatal maternal stress on offspring, brain structure, and functional connectivity could extend into young adulthood, possibly explained by the mother's objective level of exposure and their cognitive appraisal of it. Following these devastating Queensland floods in January 2011, the Project iStorm researchers merged with a team of Australian researchers who had an existing midwifery trial underway in Brisbane to create a PNMS study known as QF 2011. At the time of the floods, around 300 Brisbane women were already taking part in the midwifery trial, and researchers add assessments around maternal exposure to and arising from the floods, and stress arising from the floods. Furthermore, they obtained biological samples from the birth and from the newborn, as well as measures of maternal and infant outcomes. In total, 230 pregnant women were recruited. And notably, QF 2011 demonstrated some very similar findings to Project iStorm, although the affected babies were only followed up until they were 4 years of age. There was evidence of reduced social emotional competence, more behavioral problems, particularly in boys, greater cortisol response associated with more anxiety symptoms, increased sleep problems, low attention, poor gross motor skills, across different ages. These impacts were observed. In 1998, a landmark study examined the relationships between exposure to emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, as well as household dysfunction experienced during childhood, and health risks and behaviors and disease in adulthood. This adverse childhood events study, or ACE study, included over 9,500 adults from the US. Overall, Felici and colleagues found that a dose effect of the retrospectively reported childhood exposures across a range of health outcomes in adulthood, including mental health and substance use problems, and to a lesser extent, cardiovascular issues and diseases. Importantly, those who experienced 4 or more ACEs had increased health risks for alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, and suicidality that were 4 to 12 times higher than those with no experience of ACEs. Furthermore, they had 2 to 4 times increased risk in smoking, or increased likelihood of smoking, poor self-rated health, over 50 sexual partners, and sexually transmitted disease, while physical inactivity and severe obesity was 1.5 times more likely or higher than those with no ACEs. Based on their overall findings, the researchers suggested that the impact of ACEs on adult health outcomes was both strong and cumulative. This ACE pyramid depicted here was developed by the US's Center for Disease Control and Prevention as a conceptual framework to demonstrate how ACEs have potential influences throughout the lifespan. In this 2020 paper, Nelson and colleagues consider the links between adversity in childhood and the mental, physical health consequences that occur throughout life, reminding us that the impacts of childhood adversity can be observed across multiple systems in the body, that is cardiovascular, immune, metabolic, and brain health. While ACEs are referred to as stressors, the child's reaction to them is described as the toxic stress response. Thus, toxic stress is maladaptive and chronically dysregulated stress response that occurs in relation to prolonged or severe early life adversity. For children, the result is disruption of the development of brain architecture and other organ systems, as well as increase in lifelong risk for physical and mental disorders. These researchers suggest that there is a range of important contextual factors, including the type, duration, developmental status, and family environment, that impact how biologically embedded adverse events may be, or how likely they will lead to long-term change. ACEs may result in a variety of behavioral and emotional problems, and these are often accompanied with neurobiological consequences, so more on this later. Of great concern is the development of PTSD and other severe mental disorders following these ACEs, but often picked up at a much later stage. A better understanding of the neurobiological consequences of ACEs may lead to earlier interventions to help reduce the risk of disorder. There is a lot of evidence showing that there are structural and functional differences in brain development associated with a range of stresses in children, including profound psychosocial deprivation and exposures to maternal stress, as we've touched on. ACEs are often used to describe or define childhood trauma and maltreatment. So next we'll look closer at the neurobiology of childhood trauma and maltreatment and how this compares to PTSD, which tends to be diagnosed in adulthood. According to Teicher and Sampson, neurobiological abnormalities initially attributed to psychiatric illnesses may be a more direct consequence of childhood abuse and neglect. They hypothesized that childhood trauma and maltreatment induces a cascade of stress-mediated effects on hormones and neurotransmitters that affect the development of vulnerable brain regions. The stress hormone cortisol is central to these effects, and importantly, cortisol binds to glucocorticoid receptors, which are distributed throughout the brain. However, three key brain structures with high density of these glucocorticoid receptors, and therefore increased sensitivity to cortisol, are the hippocampus, which is important for learning and memory, the amygdala, important for processing emotional cues, and the prefrontal cortex for executive control. Furthermore, these brain structures have periods of heightened stress sensitivity, one during infancy and early childhood, and the other during late adolescence and early adulthood. In their 2016 review, Teicher and Sampson found 30 out of 37 studies on adults with childhood trauma and maltreatment showed a general pattern of decreased hippocampal volume, and this was inversely correlated with increased severity of exposure to early stress. Unlike the hippocampus, a stressed amygdala increases in volume as stress hormones can stimulate neural growth and connections, and such hypertrophy can persist long after the cessation of the stressor. However, there is a more complex pattern when it comes to the impacts of childhood trauma and maltreatment on amygdala volume, such as the age at the time of scanning. In other words, the time since the childhood exposure to the stress, and this is a key factor. Overall, studies provide evidence that early exposure to maltreatment results in an initial increase in amygdala volume, particularly noticeable during childhood. However, there is also evidence of substantial reduction in amygdala volumes in late adolescence or early adulthood, and this may be due to early exposure sensitizing the amygdala to further stress. While there is evidence of childhood trauma-exposed subjects showing reduced grey and white matter volumes throughout the cerebral cortex, these volume reductions are particularly evident in the prefrontal cortex. Other research investigated functional connectivity in individuals with histories of childhood trauma and maltreatment, with overall findings indicative of reduced top-down regulation of amygdala by prefrontal regions, reduced contextual input to the amygdala from the hippocampus, and increased connectivity of the amygdala with brainstem, which leads to more rapid physiological arousal response, such as those experienced in the flight, fight, or freeze mode. Importantly, these brain structures and these patterns of their connectivity are essentially the same as what is observed in PTSD, where there is a maladaptive fear learning and extinction process, and this is caused by hyper-responsivity of the amygdala, decreased top-down control of the prefrontal cortex, and a loss of plasticity causing malfunction in the hippocampus. So what's happening in our brain and body when we experience something stressful? For humans and many animal species, processing and dealing with stressful events involves a complex interplay between brain and body. When presented with a threat or stressful stimuli, the brain can maintain homeostasis through the activation and coordination of the neuroendocrine and autonomic nervous systems. These collective stress responses are mediated by overlapping neuronal circuits, such as the limbic forebrain, the hypothalamus, and the brainstem. Although responses vary depending on the type of stressor identified, the stress system is always activated in a coordinated fashion, starting with the collection and interpretation of sensory information, such as pain, followed by the triggering of either, or in some cases, both the sympathetic, I should say, adrenomedulla or SAM axis, which secretes adrenaline and noradrenaline, and then the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal or HPA axis, which secretes glucocorticoids, and this includes cortisol. Such responses can be initiated within seconds, but they may also last for days following a stressful event. And this immediate response generates the appropriate strategy and ideally should allow for restoration of homeostasis. However, in individuals with overactive stress systems, such as PTSD, this mechanism can be chronically impaired, and traumatic events might cause an excessive release, of glucocorticoids, which are initially beneficial. However, at excessive levels, they can be neurotoxic agents and cause damage to brain structures such as the hippocampus. Over time, this leads to prolonged deficits in glucocorticoid receptors, which then increases sensitivity to or misperceptions of stressful events. While the previously summarized stimulus-driven bottom-up processes are vital when we are faced with threat, it is important to acknowledge the pivotal role that goal-driven top-down processes play in our day-to-day survival. Symptoms of PTSD can be considered behavioral manifestations, which represent stress-induced changes in the brain's structure and function. As such, PTSD is believed to be underscored by hyperactivity in the amygdala and with associated hypo, that's underactivity in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, to the point of atrophy. To put it simply, the amygdala, which is responsible for triggering your flight or fight responses, responds too strongly, whereas the regions responsible for calming or halting this reaction do not respond strongly enough. And this graphic highlights the key differences between individuals with and without PTSD, whereby an overactive HPA axis leads to imbalances in hormone levels with continued increases in stress and anxiety. Dysfunctional thought processes and decision-making in the PFC lead to inappropriate responses to situations. The hyperactive, responsive, or hyper-responsive amygdala sets off flight or fight response, in particular in response to memories or thoughts about danger, and this is often observed as hypervigilance, while the hippocampus stores memories incorrectly and memory retrieval is affected. As mentioned above, the structural and functional changes in these regions underlie these processes. PTSD is often a chronic stress condition. Sustained changes in neurobiology can have a range of consequences if left untreated. PTSD substantially increases, for example, risk for age-related diseases, such as cardiovascular, autoimmune, and neurodegenerative diseases like dementia, as well as early mortality. However, the biological mechanisms mediating these associations remain unclear. So next, some findings revealing some clues about this. So in 2016, researchers at Boston University School of Medicine demonstrated significant links between PTSD, veterans, and accelerated aging. More specifically, Wolf and colleagues examined DNA methylation in 281 veterans, mean age of 32 years, 88% male. Methylation is one of the primary ways that the body switches genes on and off, and certain patterns of DNA methylation correlate to a person's chronological age. Wolf and colleagues found small but significant evidence that veterans with PTSD had accelerated aging of their DNA. Furthermore, advanced DNA methylation age was associated with reduced integrity in the corpus callosum, which is the massive white matter bundle connecting the brain's hemispheres. And it was also associated with poorer working memory performance. In a subsequent meta-analysis of data from 9 cohorts of over 2.5 or close to 2,500 people with PTSD, Wolf and colleagues found that childhood trauma exposure and lifetime PTSD severity evidenced significant, albeit small, associations with accelerated DNA methylation age. In an earlier study, O'Donovan and colleagues found very similar association in their study of 43 PTSD adults with and without exposure to multiple categories of childhood trauma, mean age 31, 47% female. The DNA measure used telomere length, which is another measure of biological age and is associated with reduced life expectancy. Despite being in good health, subjects with PTSD had shorter telomere length compared to those without. And furthermore, among the subjects with PTSD, those who had multiple categories of childhood traumas had the shortest telomere length. In contrast, subjects with PTSD but without childhood trauma had telomere length equal to those of the matched healthy controls. These findings suggest that chronic exposure to the psychobiological sequelae of childhood trauma could increase the risk for PTSD and changes in their DNA. And one of the study authors, Thomas Nealon, notes that a major question is whether we can actually have an effect on the telomere biology by treating PTSD. If we successfully treat PTSD, can we slow the rate of telomere shortening and thereby decrease or at least postpone the risk for some diseases of aging? Important questions like this around developing optimal interventions, treatments, and their timing depend on the accumulating evidence base generated by good research that I hope I've summarized here. Now, at the University of Sunshine Coast Thompson Institute, we're contributing to these research efforts and developing a research theme around traumatic stress across the lifespan. And this, of course, includes a focus on PTSD, given the recent launch of our new national centre, which is soon to be led by a world-renowned practitioner, researcher, Professor Alain Brunet. A big focus of this research will be on the impacts of trauma related to natural disasters and also in developing rapid psychological interventions and other supports to intervene effectively and as early as possible. So please get in touch if you want to know more. So in summary, the research covered in this webinar highlights that traumatic stress can impact people across the lifespan, and early exposure to adverse events is particularly impactful, with potential lifelong effects. Traumatic stress affects a range of neurobiological processes. However, key brain regions, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex are consistently implicated in different populations impacted by trauma. These brain regions show decreases and increases in size, and an important concept in brain science is that bigger is not always better. And rather, it's the way that these brain regions function in an interrelated way that is important. Next, differences in structural and therefore functional brain changes probably reflect differences in the timing and type of stress exposure and may include compensatory as well as adaptive changes. So, for example, that might be the reason for differences between those who have prenatal maternal stress exposure versus those with childhood trauma and maltreatment or other types thereof. Then the physiological processes involved in acute and chronic stress system responses are key to understanding disorders impacted by traumatic stress and to better identify treatments and when they may be optimal. And finally, chronic or longer term stress appears to lead to our changes in our DNA, which in turn accelerate aging processes. And clearly more research and understanding around this is needed, especially in ways to prevent it, and this is greatly needed. So if you want to know more, well, by enrolling in our program, you can discover and learn about many more important topics at the intersection of mental health and neuroscience. Hopefully this masterclass has demonstrated to you how our postgraduate program very much incorporates neuroscience research to best understand mental health conditions, and in doing so, help us all to find new solutions for their prevention and treatment. Thank you for your time and your interest, and I hope we have some time now for some questions, and we're happy to go a little bit over time as well. I'll just take a quick break and throw over to you, Chrissy.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, we have a very engaged audience, which is great. So we've got a lot of questions to get through. I'll give Dan a bit of a break and just cover some of the questions about the courses more broadly to start off with, and then I'll fire some of the tricky questions at you, Dan, if that's okay. So first question is, will adverse childhood experiences or trauma-informed practice be topics covered in the program? So yes, we do cover adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma and maltreatment, particularly in our stress-related disorders course, but we do have, trauma is obviously a theme across the programs, as it, it does create a risk factor for mental disorders. In terms of trauma-informed practice, we don't have a practical component of that, but we talk about trauma-informed strategies of care and things like that. But if you're wanting a sort of practical skill-based thing, then we actually have other courses that might be at the TI that we can talk to you about, but not specifically practical application in this course. In terms of eligibility criteria, so for a lot of people asking who don't have, say, a science degree or something like that, or a health degree. So what you can do is give us as much information as you can about your work experience. So we're looking for things like a relevant undergraduate degree or an undergraduate degree in a different area and some work experience, or something along the lines of a diploma in a related area and say 3 years or so work experience, or lots and lots of years of work experience in the mental health industry. So we do recognise those types of things as well. So the best thing you can do if you're not sure about your own eligibility is to there is a form that I think you're going to get in at the end of this webinar that you can pop your information into and we can get back to you. Or you can just jump onto online. It's an online application form, and you just fill out, put your qualifications in, put your work experience in, attach your resume, and then those types of applications do get reviewed. So we can have a look and see what kind of experience you've had. So I hope that covers a few more of the eligibility questions. There's a question about, I'm a newly registered general psychologist. Long-term, I'd like to pursue endorsement in neuropsych. Can you speak to what degree the content might be considered as RPL? Dan, we might tag team on this one. So it's currently our course is obviously not accredited. But there is potential for some of our courses to be in accredited programs down the track. For example, mental health nursing accredited courses and things like that. So currently our courses aren't in any accredited programs. But in terms of whether you'd get RPL for this course in another uni, you'd have to speak to the other university about that, and then that you would need to give them evidence of the courses you've done here. And I'll let Dan say something about the neuropsych thing.
Well, I was just going to clarify for people who might not know, RPL is recognised prior learning, or recognition of prior learning. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Christy? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the question was, if you're a neuropsych, what might be some courses that you might not need to do because of prior learning? So that would probably, in this case, apply to neurocognition and mental health, one of our courses that Chrissy covered and summarised. But of course, I would also say that I'm sure there is new content in there that you may benefit from. So we really do try to, relate mental health and neuroscience themes and topics in all of our courses, including in neurocognition. So yes, we would recognise prior learning in that regard, but also encourage you to do the course because it's a different application perhaps to what you've done before. There's a lot of other questions coming in, Chrissy, about, I guess, the science around traumatic stress. If you could help me by reading some of them out. And,
I'm just working my way down the list. So I was just letting you have a break and doing the course ones. So I'll just go through some of the other quick course ones. So is there an opportunity for students to be on campus for learning engagement with the teaching faculty? So if you're local, you are welcome to go to the Sippy Downs or Moreton Bay or any other campus that's close to you to use the library facilities, to study, to meet other students, but we don't have any designated on-campus interactions or anything at this stage, but you are welcome to use all the resources at the uni and get stuck into all the student experience there as well. So yes, then we've got, do we cover neurodivergence? Yes, absolutely. We talk about a lot of the neurodevelopmental disorders as well. Got a question about the imaging subject. Would it be advisable to wait to start till 2025? So I guess I can answer that broadly. You can do the courses in any order you want, and you might not do full time. So you could still start in semester 2 and do a different course and come back to that one later. But there's another strategy that perhaps doing the technical one that covers all the different imaging modalities in your first semester is a good idea, because then it sets you up really well for understanding the other courses when we do talk about the imaging modality. So there's kind of 2 ways to look at it. You could avoid it for a semester and come back to it, or you could go for it first and get that, I guess, foundational understanding of the neuroimaging techniques. But generally, if you're doing the course, you can choose what order you do it in. Okay, what have we got next? There's a very specific one about courses for the masters, and I think that one would be better for us to answer later. So Trish, I'll see if you could get that one, and we can answer that one later, because that's more about timetabling and enrollment specifically. So I'll go to some of the science ones. Okay, so can you please elaborate, Dan? How does stress or trauma lead to poor fine motor skills?
Oh, well, I'll have to refer you to my colleague, Gabrielle Simcock, who first authored that paper from the Queensland flood study around that. And then I didn't look into the details, but what I would note about that finding was that was particularly evident at around 2 years of age. And then it did, and actually female participants improved by 4 years of age. So there was some persistence in those impairments in males, which was interesting. But my guess is, particularly that when they're happening early, is that there's so many there's so much synaptic or neuronal proliferation growth in a child's brain. It's not surprising that that motor areas, that motor cortex, parts of the brain involved with motor skills, are impacted in such a rapid developing time of our life. But that's the best I can say, except, yeah, check out the papers. I know one was first authored by Gabrielle Simcock around that finding in the Queensland flood study.
And just to point out, I did see a comment really quickly. I didn't get to read all of it, but I believe there was someone in attendance here whose mother was part of one of the original studies, and she is now part of it, and so are her children. So that's pretty cool that we've got people at the webinar who have actually been involved in that. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and I might take the opportunity to thank you and to thank all participants in research, because without you, we can't do these things, and it's wonderful what your contribution is to the science.
Yeah. Oh gosh, Dan, we've got a lot. So if you've suffered more than one trauma in your life, how can one find out the effect that it has had on your brain?
Yeah, I saw that one. Well, I hope the point was made clear about that original adverse childhood experiences study. And, there's a cumulative effect, a dose effect. So the more traumatic experiences one has, then it does tend to lead to more outcomes. Whether you could tease out, I'm not sure if the question's about teasing out the impact of a certain event versus others. Of course, a lot of the content I covered was focusing on the brain, but in terms of intervention, I can't stress enough that it's really about a combination of psychological and other good clinical interventions. So you could work through those things with the appropriate therapist. And of course, look into the research around the neuroscience of that. I hope that answers the question. I don't think we could maybe one day with great data sets, we can even tease out the impacts of particular events and exactly how cumulative they are. But what we do know at this early stage is that on average, if you have a number of adverse childhood events or experiences, you tend to have worse outcomes if left untreated, I should stress.
Mm. I guess I'll add on to that a question about intergenerational trauma, which we sort of covered in the last webinar. So feel free to go check that out as well. But did you want to quickly answer that one, Dan?
Yeah, well, intergenerational or transgenerational trauma, it's as the name suggests, it's basically the transference of the impacts of trauma from generation to generation. So that, you know, is an example of that was covered in the webinar, like, you know, the the prenatal maternal stress stuff I covered. That is an example of intergenerational trauma, or you know, a model for it at least. But this can be, you know, something that it's been looked at in the context of Holocaust survivors and their offspring, or the offspring of people with PTSD, and in particular war veterans. So there's a whole body of research looking at intergenerational or transgenerational trauma, and very relevant, I might add, to, you know, Indigenous cultures around the world as well.
Okay, so are there any studies on PTSD injuries in high stress roles, such as frontline workers with or without childhood trauma? Yes.
Not that I know of, but I guess the more that you know, people look at data sets like this, just repeat the first part of the question, Chrissy.
Are there, has there been any research? Oh, hang on, there's two very similar ones. Sorry. Are there any studies on PTSD injuries in high stress roles, such as frontline workers with or without childhood trauma?
I'm sure they have. Yeah, I guess you know, I'm sure there are. So we could try to get back to you. I could look further into that and get back to that, the person who asked that question. I'm very sure that there have been some studies in that regard.
Yeah, there's been a couple of Australian studies, I believe, around trauma in paramedics, but also family members of paramedics as well. So that, you know, transference or vicarious trauma. And I know Professor Brunet had done some work in Canada with the Canadian Police. And a colleague of mine is working with Queensland Police currently as well. So there's lots happening in that space in terms of frontline workers. So yeah.
And yeah, the big, as one of the themes that I hope came across in the webinar is that, you know, the time, well, a lot of this does rely on self-report, of course, and the time since the trauma is an important factor as well. So if you're looking at that research, have a look into the way that the research has measured the childhood trauma, maltreatment, or adverse childhood experiences, you know, whether they did an interview, self-report, and how long it was since then. Unfortunately, a lot of studies, it tends to be in adulthood. So that is they ask those questions when they're adults, and it's temporally quite distant to the event. And there are reasons around that as well, of course.
So there's a particular question about, has there been any research on stress impacts of individuals in family court? So I'll just add to sort of what Dan was saying, in that it depends what sort of questionnaires they're using, how they're asking that information. But I guess there's more research coming out where they're broadening their questions in terms of the types of adverse experiences. For example, you know, asking about those types of things and parents incarcerated, or those any kind of traumatic experience. So I think that is gaining traction, and hopefully, you know, recognizing other aspects of trauma rather than the ones that have been, you know, historically and traditionally asked. I'm trying to choose them, Dan. You can help me if you want. Okay, this is a good one. Does chronic PTSD impact the brain's ability or mechanism of interpreting pain? For example, do people with PTSD experience pain more intensely?
That's a good question. I don't know an answer straight away. What I would say is that there's some interesting theories about the psychological aspects of pain. So I would therefore assume that you know, people with PTSD probably have, you know, there'd be psychological impacts due to the PTSD that would also change the way that they feel, perceive, and respond to pain. But yeah, I don't know any particular research offhand on that.
Go ahead if you can. Is it possible to alter? Okay, I'll answer this. Is it possible to alter the subjects for the grad cert, i.e. study 4 subjects, but study 1 from the grad depth and swap out 1 from the grad cert? Currently they are fixed in terms of the 4 that are in the grad cert for various reasons, in terms of the course planning, the graduate outcomes for those different courses, and the kind of levels of assessment tasks as well. And it is something that we have in mind for the future. We just don't know when that will happen just yet. So currently it is as it is. So yes.
I've got a question here. I'll read one out.
Yep.
So there was a question along the, as follows. Is there much covered in the course around neuroscience plus trauma plus ADHD, or how much ADHD relevant content? So ADHD does feature quite a lot in the youth mental health and neurobiology course. There's a whole module virtually dedicated to ADHD and disruptive behavior disorders. What I would say about the combination, I mean, and of course the neuroscience of ADHD, the neurobiology of ADHD, and similar things in adolescence and childhood. But what I would say about this question around it being neuroscience plus trauma plus ADHD, it's a bit of a plug for the way we design, especially the assessments in the mental health and neuroscience postgrad program. So what I'm trying to say is we encourage through assessment for there to be overlapping themes and constructs in a written piece or a presentation, for example. So integrating research and theories and clinical information around the relationship between trauma and ADHD would be a really interesting topic. So that's the point of our program. We want you to look at neuroscience and neurobiology, apply it to a mental health problem. Often comorbidity or complexity is the rule rather than the exception. So looking into something like, the relationship between trauma and ADHD and the neuroscience around that would be a great topic for an assessment and easy to do because that's the way our assessments are designed.
Cool. I think we've got time for 2 more questions, Dan, and then we are going to call it a day. So I'll do one course-related one, and then you can do one other one. So is this eligible for CSP subsidised fees? So yes, currently the graduate certificate and the graduate diploma are Commonwealth supported places. So that's a massively reduced cost at the moment. The master's currently is not, but you can do the graduate diploma with the CSP and then potentially apply later for the master's. That's the way to do it. Did you have a specific one you wanted to approach, Dan?
Yeah, I'll try to. Sorry, I know you said 1. I'll go with 2. So 1 is if a child has early interventions, can it impact the long-term outcome for the child? So my area of focus in my research is youth mental health. I would say yes, absolutely. Early interventions are almost always, a great thing to do. The earlier we intervene, the better, particularly in childhood and adolescence. The trick is, getting the right intervention for the right person, or for a given person. And the other one was a question around DNA changes, are they around, I think the question is, is this in relation to the expression of DNA or something else? I'm not a geneticist, but the way that literature that I touched on is very much in the realm of epigenetics. And the point about that is changes in the DNA itself. So the telomere shortening is a physical change in DNA, is my understanding. And it also impacts the expression of the DNA. And then it has all these biological, impacts in brain and body.
I think that's it then, Dan. Should we wrap it up?
Yes, I guess we should. As I said in the very beginning, we'll try to curate and get some general feedback about some of the questions that we missed. I guess I should just say thank you all for being involved. Thanks, Chrissy. Thanks for the UniSC team in the background, doing a lot of the work around handling questions and supporting this webinar. And yeah, thank you for attending. Look forward to you being involved in the mental health and neuroscience postgraduate courses and programs in some way, shape, or form. And if you have any questions further, yeah, get in touch. Happy to speak about and answer your emails or calls about enrollment and other questions you have about the programs. Thank you. Have a wonderful day and take care.